grateful to the Montana Historical Society for having me, to Kirby Lambert and Tina for inviting me to speak tonight. Newspaper archives and the archivists who preserve them have brought so many lost things back to me, and I'm forever in your debt. I'd like to give a shout out to Tom Cook and also to Jim Rickman, Executive Director of the Montana Newspaper Association, for getting the word out about tonight's event and also the performance in Great Falls. We do share the same mission, which is to advance and sustain the news publishing industry. So thank you all for coming tonight. It's wonderful to come home to Montana. I live in LA, but I was born up in Wolf Point many, many years ago. As you know, my dad was a newspaper man. About 15 years ago, my brother and I took a road trip together to honor kind of a last wish of our moms. She said, take a drive through our past before it's too late. I know that their newspaper years were the happiest years of their lives, and we lost her in 1994. So we drove out of Denver on a hot July day and dodging tornadoes, headed north to Owatonna, Minnesota, where my grandparents once owned a small farm. And my dad's first paper was the Owatonna Photo News, where he started out as a printer's devil when he was 15 to help support his family. The farm, of course, is now housing development, so we hung around for just over an hour and drove up to the Twin Cities, cutting west across the Badlands, and the next morning we finally pulled onto the Fort Peck Reservation high in the northeastern corner of Montana, which you know. And in the local library, we found our birth announcements in Dad's second paper, the Wolf Point Herald News. And there, again, we only spent a few hours. We'd allocated a week for our trip, but, you know, Montana, you get addicted to driving, and we just loved riding together. So in 3 days, we only had Cody left to see. And crossing the Montana border into Wyoming, you know how the scenery changes so dramatically, and we started our descent into the Bighorn Basin. We hadn't been there for decades, and the Absaroka Range appears out of nowhere, and to the east lay the Bighorns, and it was so beautiful we looked at each other and started laughing. In Cody, we headed straight into the Whitney Gallery of Western Art, which we watched being built as kids. I was there at the groundbreaking of that museum. And we looked around and found ourselves standing in front of Charlie Russell's painting, waiting for a Chinook. And my brother grew very quiet. And we were tired, and the drive was taking it out of us. And at the time, he was quite ill, and I would lose him a year later. And when I asked him what was wrong, he recalled standing in front of waiting for a Chinook as a little boy and asking our dad to explain it to him. And taking the full measure of the painting, I felt gripped by fear for what the future held for him. And we were very close. And as older brothers often do, he comforted me, and he said, I'll be okay no matter what. I'm just remembering Dad. So the Montana Historical Society houses the Montana Newspaper Project, which you've just heard about. It's a very, very important endeavor. And I've written a play called Waiting for a Chinook, a new play about old newspapers, inspired by the paintings of Charles M. Russell. And you all know that the original Chinook is next door in the McKay Gallery. Waiting for Chinook is a play about newspapers, newspaper archives, and Kip Hinton, my cowboy editor dad, which will be read, as you know, in the galleries of the Russell. And I'd like to say that counting the paintings, I have a $100 million set up there, so I hope you guys will, they were setting it up as I left, and it's just going to be a very, very beautiful event, and I'm honored that this work makes it into that museum. Chinook was developed for the 2013 UW Snowy Range Summer Theater Festival, and we had a fully staged production in Laramie last summer. And there we recreated an opulent Western reading room on stage along with its basement archive. Chinook has 3 characters. There's Vince, a disillusioned, downsized Los Angeles Times reporter searching for place and meaning in the archives of his dad's old newspapers. There's Ramona, a dedicated archivist, conservative and lonely, who acts as both his sparring partner and guide. And Cliff, his father from a prior time, who relives a day in the life of a country editor before our eyes. That's one of my dad's images. When newspapers started closing in 2008, it got me to thinking, what would my dad think about it? And then it occurred to me that I'd never gone back to his enterprise to read his editorials or articles or see his photographs, which I knew he took thousands of. And at that time, I'd had a career correction of my own. I'd walked out of a 20-year position in the film industry with no prospects. I just didn't want to be the guy next to the guy for the rest of my life. I couldn't do it. So I had questions, but no one left in my family to ask them of. And so I remembered waiting for a Chinook and came back home to search for my dad, a Wyoming country editor in the archives of his old papers. Charles Russell is called Montana's cowboy artist. And in this 1903 version of his famous painting, Waiting for a Chinook, a starving steer is freezing on a snowy plain as a pack of wolves close in. A Chinook is a warm western wind which starts over the Pacific, rises over the mountains, and heats up when it sweeps down the eastern slopes of the Rockies. Chinooks are sometimes called snow eaters. A strong Chinook can melt a foot of snow in a day, and I didn't know this, but without Chinooks, livestock on the open range couldn't survive the harsh winters of 100 years ago. So in the hard winter of 1886-87, the Chinooks never showed up. And as Charlie Russell observed, while a horse is smart enough to paw under the snow for grass, a cow will starve waiting for it to melt. Russell was known for his annotated illustrations, word paintings. See where he scrawls last of the 5,000 at the bottom of this painting. His original postcard-size rendition was sent to absentee cattle barons by way of explaining why they went bust. So in my view, Waiting for a Chinook is a political cartoon, and it's a masterpiece of simplicity. So when I look at this ravenous steer about to be torn apart, it's irresistible not to compare it to the state of decline of the Metro newspaper. And what happened to an industry that was always so profitable, so necessary, and so integral to our American way of life? And the rapid drop in daily newspaper circulation in 2008, when I first started this, was really astonishing and frightening. It was a perfect storm of 5 converging major systems, five wolves at the door, so to speak. First, a family newspaper was content to earn 10 to 15% profit, but when Wall Street started buying in, their stated goal was 35%. Second, to get to the 35%, operations were streamlined, newsroom staffs reduced, and quality content was cut, so readership took a hit. Third, newspapers did have their heads in the sand about the internet. Online news aggregators began to lure away readers, dramatically affecting circulation. Fourth, the advent of Craigslist and other online penny savers killed classified advertising revenues. Fifth, the economy took a near fatal nosedive in 2008. So advertising dollars that would have been available were gone at an alarming rate, and the industry woke up. The internet was real, and it was costing them big time. When everybody finally figured out it was time to start to paw under the snow, it was too late. So I've just identified the 5 wolves in Charles Russell's Waiting for a Chinook. For the purposes of our allegory, what then does our poor steer represent? Originally, I just assumed the steer was a newspaper business, end of speech, but I've since changed my mind. What's in jeopardy is not the daily newspaper or even professional journalism, and what would Russell say? He's not here, so I'll guess. If we as consumers of information continue to accept the blurring of lines between opinion and fact, news and entertainment, the starving steer will be us, and we'll have no one to blame but ourselves. Without objective investigative reporting from a reliable, constant source we can trust, we're the steer that's in big trouble here. You can't have democracy without the free flow of information, without a free press. And as it is now, like this poor steer, we're starving for the truth. In the hard winter of 2008-2009, the Pew Research Center of the news media reported that the newspaper industry was perilously close to free fall. Daily circulation dropped by nearly 5%, ad revenue fell by 16%, and roughly 5,000 full-time newspaper jobs were lost. The stock of publicly traded newspapers fell 83%. After losing $11 million, E.W. Scripps closed the door of Denver's Rocky Mountain News in early 2009, 2 months shy of its 150th birthday. To put this in perspective, the Rocky covered both the Civil War and the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Centers. In addition to the Rocky, the Tribune Company, including Los Angeles Times and Chicago Tribune, filed for bankruptcy. The Journal Register Philadelphia papers and Minneapolis Star Tribune went into bankruptcy in early 2009. This trend was so alarming that the United States Senate Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and the Internet, chaired by John Kerry, held a hearing on the future of journalism in May of that year. So there was a lot of hand-wringing and recriminations about Wall Street greed, the conceit of aging publishers who failed to institute paywalls because they refused to take the internet seriously, that online news aggregators, parasites some said, were eating the host, and yes, that this downward trend would sorely test democracy itself. From 2013 to present day, nearly 20,000 newsroom jobs have been cut, down from 60 to 40,000, never to return. And I'm reminded of playwright Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Is the Daily Reporter the Willy Loman of the 21st century? Last year, I was privileged to interview John Temple, who was editor and publisher of The Rocky when it closed its doors. And he generously spoke with me for 90 minutes, very emotionally about how awful it felt to preside as editor at such a time. It was brutal, he said. On YouTube, if this interests you, there's a short documentary called Final Edition about the last days of The Rocky, which is really terrific. In my play, Ramona the newspaper archivist laments to the audience, "We're all sad about what's happening to the morning paper." For over 100 years, hardworking, resourceful editors have cheated fires, floods, tornadoes, and personal illness to get the paper out, but lack of money can silence a press forever. And to save it, they have to make it pay. When Scripps announced the closing to the staff assembled around the Rocky news desk, true to form, the journalists in the room pulled out their pads and started taking notes like they were covering the story. But they were the story. And that's something that any reporter worth his or her salt does not like very much. So John suggested that I attended the Rockies' 5-year closing reunion at the Denver Press Club, which I did last February. And I wouldn't make a good reporter. I felt like a voyeur, watching the tearful hugs, and I was eavesdropping on the what have you been doings and straining to hear answers like I'm managing a knitting store in Evergreen, or I converted the basement so I could rent out the upstairs. I asked a woman at the bar how many of the 500 people who attended were still in the business, and she said maybe 2%. So I left after 45 minutes. Even after 5 years, a paper cut still stings, which isn't to say that many aren't doing fine or better in new careers. A few were hired by the Denver Post, others moved on to higher paying public relations jobs, but where some adapted to new technologies, many could not. As Ramona artlessly asked Cliff in Waiting for a Chinook, "Did you ever wonder why they let you go, but they kept the guy or gal at the next desk?" And I think what Russell is trying to say with this painting, what he was telling the ranchers is you have to adapt. And that's true for anyone. In the downsizing of the Los Angeles Times, I talked with front page editor Roger Smith, and he told me it was not an exact science how they let people go. It was often inexplicable why a high-producing Pulitzer Prize nominee might be axed when other heads-down writers kept their desks. And layoffs like those really terrified newsrooms. If he or she got let go, well, what chance would I have? So Roger introduced me to a much-admired downsized Times political journalist, Scott Martell, who met me for a coffee and told me about what those days were like. He explained that newspaper jobs weren't rich jobs, but enough to live comfortably. And at the start of this century, and I'm talking 2000, print journalists were at the top of their game. And they shared a common conceit he admitted to. They thought they would always have their jobs, and what they did could never be replaced and would always be needed. Plus, it was the greatest job in the world. It was unthinkable. Like many laid-off journalists, Scott was in his early 50s. His kids were starting college. Many houses in Southern California around the country were underwater. The stock market had tanked everyone's 401ks. And there were few golden parachutes. It was 2 weeks' pay for every year you worked, which is pretty standard. And luckily, his wife had a full-time job, and with his buyout, they paid off the mortgage. He wrote books and kind of hunkered down. Scott had to adapt like the downsized employees of any industry that suffers a major correction. But an additional foreboding haunted many of them. What about our subscribers? Without newspapers, where would they get the news? And like the Senate subcommittee, they too expressed fear for the future of democracy itself. The American newspaper has been around for approximately 300 years, I've learned, when James Franklin, brother of Ben, launched the New England Current. Journalism professor Philip Meyer wrote a book, The Vanishing Newspaper. He believes that the main function of the newspaper is not news but influence, which some would argue that's how it's always been. He also predicted that the final copy of the final newspaper would be delivered on somebody's doorstep in 2043, having something to do with the death of the last baby boomer. How many of you have a daily routine where you send the dog out to retrieve the morning paper, sit down with your cup of coffee, and leisurely open it up to read the headlines? That was my childhood. The dog went and the dog came back. And it's been said by just about every newspaper philosopher out there that the best news for print journalism is that people who read papers are living longer. And this is an interesting fact, but in India, with so much population lacking access to the internet, print newspapers will be booming for the next 100 years, they say. So the rapid decline of the paper was and remains astonishing and scary. And the fact is, you can't have democracy without the free flow of information from a constant source you can trust. And you don't have democracy when journalists are arrested, or beaten by cops, or beheaded in Iraq, and newspapers silenced for dissenting opinions. As consumers of information and as news junkies, we have a culpability too. And the hunger for our news fix, and as more and more of us are driven online to online aggregators and infotainment radio and cable merchants for hard news, what are the wolves in us to watch out for? First, our addiction to the comfort zones of our own biases, wearing blinders and seeking only that which we know or what adheres to our personal belief system, and ignoring opposition opinion or theory. Second, accepting without question the blurring of lines, which I said before, about opinion and fact and news and entertainment. Third, embracing the false equivalency of two sides to every story. Every story does not have two equal sides, or even two sides. Fourth, refusing to consider the source and name it when quoting it. How many times is a story credited from other source? You know, driving up here, I was listening to whatever station, and I was, you know, the Great Falls Tribune was quoted, was the source material for a lot of what was repeated. And, you know, how often do you hear the Wall Street Journal reported, or sources from the Washington Post said, or Bloomberg said? When facts are reported without sourcing, they tend to be opinions. And by the way, you're hearing a lot of opinions tonight, I know. Fifth, failing to demand accountability from our news sources when they get the facts wrong or late. CNN has a terrific Sunday program called Reliable Sources, which I've enjoyed, and which covers how the media covers us, and NPR has On the Media, so something to look for. And this begs the question, since it's been 5 years, how has the print newspaper industry dealt with the 5 scavenger wolves? Remember the Wolf of Wall Street? Well, some of you may have read as recently as last week that Wall Street, Time Warner, Tribune, News Corp, Gannett are jettisoning their print assets into separate standalone enterprises to, quote, sink or swim. Michael Wolff of USA Today calls print employees the spun-off people. And he also says that many newspapers and magazines are still profitable, a fact that also has not gone unnoticed by Wall Street, and apparently 10% might not be so bad after all. Wolf number 2, staff and content got cut. Layoffs are unfortunately still on the horizon, and newspaper real estate is on the block in favor of smaller, more economic workspaces. State, national, and foreign bureaus remain drastically reduced or shuttered altogether. Many foreign correspondents are now independent contractors, woefully underinsured and compensated for the enormous risks they take for the service they bravely provide. I ask you, is the dearth of foreign bureaus why we didn't know ISIS was bearing on Baghdad's city limits? I mean, did anybody else look up and go, well, when did this all happen? Was the drastic newspaper correction why they didn't know Wall Street was tanking in 2008? Why don't we know in advance about the big stuff is my question. And how are they going to bring readership up by reducing quality and output? But there's some good news in this. The Los Angeles Times hired Scott Martell, and he's doing excellent work again. So wolf number 3, newspapers had their head in the sand about, sorry about that, about the internet. It seems pretty clear that there are really excellent websites that newspapers have adapted, and it's trending in their favor in the battle with the HuffPost and the Daily Beast. I visit the New York Times, which has a paywall about after 10 articles are viewed, and the Los Angeles Times, which is not, but both papers are delivered to my door daily. I come from a family of clippers. A clipped article left lying on my desk is an act of love and consideration, and a bit nicer than a link. I tend to surf the web when I'm looking for something I already saw in the papers, or heard about on the news. And I love Twitter for that reason, because I can follow journalists I respect. I mean, Twitter is the massive linking service. It's terrific. And that said, the democracy of the printed newspaper forces me to at least scan headlines about people, places, and events that don't normally interest me or inviting me to read on. Fourth, Craigslist killed the classifieds. Well, Amazon, Google, and Match.com, funny in threes, and print is still outgunned. Wolf number 5, the economy crashed in 2008. Since 2008, the Dow's risen nearly 10,000 points, and last year Amazon's Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Warren Buffett paid Media General $142 million for its weekly and daily newspapers, which Forbes wrote that targeting just the smaller papers is a big clue about his forecast for the industry. Unlike regionals or big city papers, small town newspapers don't have a lot of competition or good substitutes. That, and recall Professor Meyer's theory about influence. And speaking of influence, when Rupert Murdoch recently tried to buy the LA Times, other buyers started swarming, and they ended up not selling. Lots of wealthy people have more money, and whatever you think about Mr. Murdoch, who Frank Rich accuses of being sentimental about newspapers, thank goodness, his News Corp spun off from 21st Century Fox with no debt and $2.6 billion in cash. Other papers have been spun off with a load of debt, so they're going to have to work very hard. And 5 years ago, a friend warned me I better wrap this dying newspaper project up. Newspapers aren't going to be dying forever, and that's good news, and I agree. And what I took him to mean is that newspapers will never go away altogether, and I agree, but only if we don't submit to sentimentality or what Rich calls inky tears. He writes, the decline and fall of old media was inevitable and unavoidable, and the end of civilization as we know it is not in the cards. The reigning giants have nearly always been caught napping by transformative change. And a few examples, well, talkies to silent movies, television to film and stage, Napster to the recording industry, DVD to movie theaters, Netflix to DVD, and then, unfortunately, everything to publishing. So in the film business, theater chains wrote themselves off with the advent of DVD and the internet, yet in the past 5 years, box offices exploded, even in hard financial times. Why? Because people like to go to movie theaters and eat popcorn. Just like they like to drink coffee and read their morning papers. There may be fewer newspapers to choose from, but serious people always seek serious news. And as Ramona says in Waiting for a Chinook, when you send the dog out for the morning paper, the dog's got to have something to bring back. So the craving for hard news is in the blood of this country. And if Charles Russell's Waiting for Chinook teaches us anything, it's that we're always going to have to think more like horses and dig for it. Like those Helena cattle barons, we're going to have to adapt. And there's other good news in all of this. Where metro newspapers may be getting skinny, community newspapers are holding their own. Why? Because the national media, both print and television, abandoned rural areas in small-town America a long time ago. As Ramona says, in a small town, a siren means trouble for somebody you know. And to that point, last month's Crib Green report says it right. Newspapers continue to be the only professional local information gathering source, and quality local information continues to have value. In my play, Waiting for a Chinook, my small-town archivist informs the big city journalist Vince that there's accountability in small towns that you don't have in the big city. When readers disagree with a big city editorial, they blame the paper. In a small town, they blame the editor. And it's easy to take on a Wyoming rancher whose livelihood is being threatened by federal water restrictions when you're sitting in a big city newsroom, but you might not be so courageous when you find yourself standing next to him in the Silver Saddle Saloon. In Montana, I can name 87 community newspapers dedicated to picking up the slack, to fighting off the wolves. Community newspapers aren't going anywhere, and they don't need a Senate subcommittee to interfere in their business model. It's been said that a town without a newspaper is a community without a soul. For the press release of Chinook in Laramie last summer, I asked Jim Hicks, former publisher of the Buffalo Bulletin and a Wyoming Press Association Hall of Fame inductee, for a quote about the value of community newspapers. He knew and liked my dad, and here's what he said. As the middle guy in 3 generations of small-town community journalism stretching back to the 1930s, I've seen great impact forced by technology. Expansion of radio into small towns was going to kill the community newspaper. Then television was the death call for the little paper. Now it's the internet and all of its forms of personal communication. But somehow, objective reporting and journalism ethics keep the printed word afloat in most of these towns and villages. And citizens recognize they have no substitute for an effective watchdog of a local government than their hometown paper. And at this level, the Fourth Estate is alive and well, and bless those who toil on by spending hours at meetings of city councils, school boards, or county commissions, and then use their skills to present the information in an organized manner the citizen can grasp in minutes of reading. From 1956 to 1962, my father, Kip Hinton, was editor of the prize-winning Cody Enterprise, originally founded in 1899 by Buffalo Bill. He was not a country club editor. He was country trained, and that's a compliment. Under my dad's editorial and photographic stewardship, the Enterprise achieved state and national recognition and honors in keeping with William F. Cody's original mission. This is the only known photo of Buffalo Bill with the Enterprise. Of all the business endeavors Buffalo Bill began, many failed, but the Cody Enterprises stood the test of time. And the first issue of the Enterprise was published with an editor's note from Cody's partner, Colonel Peake. This, the first number of the Enterprise, is handed out sans excuses other than an expression that each succeeding number shall be a trifle superior to its predecessor. Cody was never a hands-on editor, but his contribution to Wyoming's 100-year history of community newspapers cannot be denied. True, the Enterprise was probably intended to be another monument to him. He was less interested in introducing neighbor to neighbor and keener on connecting Cody to the world at large, and God bless him for that. Over the years, the Cody Enterprise has been in the hands of many great and colorful publishers and editors. My uncle, Mike Vukolich, a veteran publisher of community newspapers in Montana and Wyoming, owned the Enterprise from 56 to 67. We moved down from Wolf Point to Cody in tandem with the two cars, the two families. A great newspaper needs a committed owner-publisher, but I'd like to resume my talk about country editors for the work in the trenches they do for the love of newspapering and 24/7 service to their communities. The Enterprise was in good hands with editors like Colonel Peake. After 30 years, it's been in terrific hands with publisher-editor Bruce McCormick, and I may be biased, but it was in great hands with my dad, too. In his capacity as editor, my dad loved all things Cody country. He was a Golden Gloves boxer when called upon. He was also a champion of the underdog. It's important to understand that when I went back to Cody 5 years ago, I hadn't been there for 50 years. Asking for help with my research was a testament to how highly regarded my dad was to his 80-year-old friends who are the grandfathers of Wyoming. They put their arms around me, assisting me with introductions. He had the greatest sense of humor and delicious irony, and these are former Wyoming Senator Al Simpson's kind words. His best friend, Cody attorney Ernie Goppert, made certain that I understand he wasn't doing anything for me. I'm doing it because I loved your dad, he said. And when I contacted Bruce McCormick, editor of the Enterprise, he reminded me that, or publisher and editor, he reminded me that in 1987, an arson fire which tragically killed 2 Cody men, had also destroyed many original records. It wiped out past issues of the Cody Enterprise stored in the basement, and with this, my dad's original writings, prints, and negatives. Bruce told me that the Enterprise was all on microfilm at the Wyoming Archives, and partial collections of hard copies had been painstakingly assembled at the Park County Archives and the McCracken Western Research Library at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. So I flew to Cody for a long weekend in the beautiful McCracken. I couldn't find my dad's anywhere on the database, and I thought he'd been forgotten. Through the courtesy of Library Director Mary Robinson, several stacks of flat file boxes containing old copies of the Enterprise during his day were rolled into the research room on a gleaming silver cart. And together we loaded the first of the boxes onto the table and opened it up. Inside a stack of brittle yellowing copies of the paper, of the Cody Enterprise. Turning the first page under the masthead, Kip Hinton, editor, Cody Enterprise. And I suddenly realized that instead of my dad being nowhere, he was everywhere. As editor, he was the nexus of the community, and I wondered in that moment if, as much as I was reaching into the past to find him, if my dad had anticipated this moment and was reaching forward into the future to find me. I was instructed as to how to handle fragile newspapers, scooping gently, raising it up. A newspaper is an archivist's worst nightmare. Coming face to face with the stacks of old newspapers, old boxed newspapers was very moving. In Chinook, Ramona calls down to Vince, "Can you see it? From William F. Cody to present day." Over 100 years of history staring you in the face. It moved some of my readers to tears. "I love my job," she says. Turning the pages, I came upon this early Enterprise cover, which for reasons you may understand, is my personal favorite. This is me. This is me at age 4. I was the New Year's baby of 1957, and this photo was taken by Jack Richard, a hero of Wyoming. The photo caption, which comes with it, tellingly explains, "A thoughtful Cody boy rides into the new year 1957 on a bugling elk to bring Enterprise readers best wishes for a happy and prosperous new year. While 1957 may be just another year to this little boy, the decisions made and guidance needed to preserve the free world and maintain a lasting peace may be mirrored in his eyes. In 1957 may become, in his later years, one of the most important of his life." This quote speaks to the responsibility my dad and all of his contemporaries felt, both in the commission of his duties as a community newspaper editor and his craft as a journalist, to find the facts, check them twice, and arrange those facts in a cohesive, understandable way. This is how to write and edit a story. And the community newspaper, for many aspiring journalists, is where they learn how to do just that. As I continued glancing through my dad's papers looking for more pictures of me, I was astounded that for a weekly community newspaper, just how sophisticated it was. That was my bias, I'm sure. As I continued glancing through my dad's papers looking, I found an editorial written by my dad called "The Typical Country Editor." In response to a question posed from the American press, it asked, "What sort of man is the typical country editor?" And this, in part, is what he wrote to his readers. The American press finds certain things can be said. In general, their roots are firmly embedded in the America of a past era, an America which thrived on such words as self-reliance and independence, and they stubbornly resist all movements wherein social groups might be benefited, but at the expense of the individual's freedom. Mollycoddling by government is one of the pet hates of the country editor. His heroes are the founding fathers of our nation who believed in a minimum amount of government and a maximum amount of individual freedom. He's the champion of free enterprise, and the freer the better. In other words, the typical country editor believes in the ideals that not only made this country great, but maintains individual freedom and dignity along with national greatness. And it made me ponder, what would life be like for a small town without a community newspaper? And what good is a community newspaper without an honest, independent, and civic-minded editor? I was given a terrific book called Community Journalism from Betty Kennedy, written by her late husband, Bruce Kennedy. Bruce and Betty were contemporaries of my dad's and published the Grable Standard. It's a knockout of a read. The technology Bruce Kennedy so painstakingly described may be out of date, but not the philosophy or ethics of community journalism. It still required reading for journalism majors and community journalism. This book greatly informs my play. This man loved newspapering, and I wouldn't want to mess with him. I'd sure take him at his word. He seems like the kind of fellow who might have initiated online newspapers rather than wait around for somebody else to beat him to it. If my dad or Jim Hicks or Bruce Kennedy had been invited to speak at that Senate subcommittee on the future of journalism, what might they have said? For starters, I think they might have recommended keeping your local newspaper in the hands of a town-proud country editor with demonstrated respect for the needs of his readers. Put your profit back into your business like staff and new technology. Listen to your readers. Bruce Kennedy liked to send his printer home and finish the final third run of the Standard himself. Jim Hicks personally delivered freshly minted copies of the Bulletin to the local drugstore and the supermarket. Nothing made him more happy than to find his readers waiting, even in inclement weather, for a warm newspaper. 50 years ago, when my dad worked at the Enterprise, then as now, people were deeply worried about the future of this country. A war president was retiring. A young, charismatic new leader was taking his place. The battle for states' rights raged. Socialism seemed to be at our throats. A controversial new government health care program for senior citizens was being hotly debated. Bomb shelters were being constructed. My dad even reported that the bees were disappearing. As school children, we had regular air raid drills over at Westside Elementary School. Can you imagine a newspaper being more worried about making profits and sacrificing to report the news at a time like that? When your neighbors are counting on you to tell them the truth in a way that doesn't scare the wits out of them? My dad was not in the newspaper business for money, which isn't to say that he wouldn't have liked and needed to earn much more. I know my parents struggled to make ends meet, and once a week the paper went to press. As I glanced through his papers, I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't know how hard he really worked. Back then, a country editor had to wear a lot of different hats. My dad was editor, photographer, reporter, and writer. And he didn't do it alone. He had a small, capable, and dedicated, very great staff. But a country editor has to get along with everyone while being professionally beholden to no one. And if you trusted him to take pictures of your kids' birthday parties, you were more apt to trust his opinion on the editorial page. My dad worked 10 to 12 hours a day, and on press day, I doubt he even came home. His nights and days belonged to the Enterprise, and during the day, he pounded the pavement, covering the town, sitting through countless civic meetings. Cody's the county seat. He covered the high school sporting events, which took his nights. He attended thousands of birthday parties, retirement parties, and regional conventions. If I wanted to know where my dad was on a given day, all I had to do was read the Cody Enterprise. And like other men and women living in Cody, he also gave his time to local organizations, the Lions Club, the Bighorn Retrievers Club, and he volunteered with the Cody Rural Fire Department. I'll use my pointer for the first time. This is my dad. This is his friend Ernie. And the rest of them are Cody's bankers, lawyers, mechanics, sheriffs, teachers, and insurance agents. And they weren't in their 20s. They put their lives on the line, stopping whatever they were doing to put out the fire. When an emergency struck, my dad ran out the door with his camera. Here's a photograph my father took on a tanker fire at Oregon Basin. It's called 6 Against the Blaze. Look at their firefighting gear. They're wearing business clothes. They're wearing business clothes. In addition to honoring a dedicated group of volunteer firemen heavily battling a massive oil fire, this photo also is a chronicle of their lives interrupted. They left offices, dinner tables, and softball with the kids. Smoky ash and soot had to be scrubbed out of their good clothes, and there was no compensation for dry cleaning. There was no fire retardant jumpsuits, no medics, no ambulances. My dad lost consciousness in this fire. He nearly died. Chief of Cody RFD, Ernie Goppert, pulled him to safety and saved his life. And here's an excerpt from a personal account written by Walter Hoffman, a fellow fireman who came with an original photo of my dad's that was sent to me by his son. There was no doubt we had lost any hope of handling the fire, and we were about out of water, so we decided to pull out. Kip Hinton from the Cody Enterprise was on a side hill, trying to get the picture he would call 6 Against the Blaze. As I came back to the edge of the hill, Kip had fallen and was on the way to the hospital with either a heart attack or seizure. The fire had drawn 50 or 60 spectators. Some men were running hard to get to their vehicles. I felt a cold wind of lonesomeness and abandonment blow over me. On the 100-mile per hour drive back to the Co Memorial Hospital, Ernie recalled my dad saying, "Do you have my camera? Did you get the film?" 6 Against the Blaze won the sweepstakes prize at the Wyoming Press Association. It's an astonishing photograph for what it says about the indomitable spirit of Cody, which still has a volunteer fire department today. I discovered that it was also commemorated in the Cody Firehouse with a painting by a local artist, where it hangs there today. Isn't that great? This tradition, the Enterprise was nationally recognized for a weekly special photographic section in the tradition of Look and Life magazines. In it, they capitalized on the extraordinary beauty of the Cody country, our easy-going way of life, our historical and artistic heritage, and the good hunting and fishing helped too. This tradition was started by Jack Richard, the great Cody country photojournalist and a former publisher himself. Jack contracted to do some work with the Enterprise for my Uncle Mike, and he and my dad were close friends. So between Jack Richards, semi-retired and couldn't be everywhere, and my dad, who loved to be everywhere, the photo section of the Cody Enterprise was the best world ambassador Buffalo Bill could have possibly hoped for. Jack shot this four-color transparency of my dad on a hunting trip. I call it Dad at Work. That's him laying with our dog. And Jack liked to stage photographs, so this is not, the sense of humor is terrific. For most country editors, the summers meant nights off because the high school sports program was on summer vacation, but not for Cody, home of Cody Night Rodeo. According to my dad's photos, covering Night Rodeo must have been fun because he had the best seat in the house. Look at this muddy steer wrestler's joy. And here's Cody's own Enoch Walker, 1960 world champion saddleback rider. He died when a horse fell on him coming out of the chute 20 years later. And how about 8-year-old junior bull rider Rodney Goings? Like Charles Russell's Waiting for a Chinook, it says more than words could ever say. This photograph speaks to the Wyoming of our childhood, a time when with greater risk and fewer rules. The reward was our personal freedom, and it was a time when kids could wander and parents expected our safe return. Wyoming is a tough state in personal philosophy and physical geography. Winters are tough. Summers can be hot and 80-mile zephyrs scream down the canyons. The harsh reality is, of course, that not every kid survives the fall. I should mention that this young bull rider was 8-year-old Rodney Goings. And I'll tell you something, I always wish that I kind of always said it was me, but now I can't, so same age. But anyway, last thing is that a girl named Kathy Harper won the event, but she didn't get the cover. A very wonderful rodeo and equestrian photographer named Louise Alserpa looked at this photograph, and she wrote me and she said, the best rodeo photographs chronicle failure, whether it's the man, woman, or the beast. When failure's in action, somebody's succeeding, and that adds to the drama of the rodeo photograph. I also discovered a weekly column my dad started in 1959 called What a Week with Kip Hinton. What a Week was a Will Rogers-style collection with funny, informative, and poignant observations about the people and goings-on in the community of Cody. What a Week was voted Best Weekly Column of the Year in '59 by the Wyoming Press Association. As Ramona says in the play, they hand out lots of awards. If you want to know what Cody was up to on a weekly basis between those years, look it up. This is the complete compilation of all my dad's What a Weeks and his editorials and his photographs, and I'm proud to say that I got this because of an archive, and I wanted to address the legacy of my dad, and this now in the collection of the Wyoming archives. It's in the collection of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center of the West and the Autry National Center in Los Angeles. So here are a few of my favorites from What a Week. Don't feed the bears. We see those bears everywhere in Yellowstone Park. There are even signs for the bears telling them not to accept food. Yet 42 persons were mauled, bitten, or scratched by the furry creatures this season. Or, slowly our Western traditions fade away. A Billings justice of the peace has ruled that a cow cannot give valid testimony even though she has claimed a maverick calf of her own. The act of a cow claiming a calf has settled many a maverick ownership dispute. At the expense of being cited for contempt of court, we argue on behalf of the cow. Judge, she's a mother and deserves to be heard. He liked to rib his friends, and he had kind of a dark sense of humor, my dad. When Ernie Goppert and his bride Marjorie whooshed out of the Park County Country Club in an Avery helicopter, all plans for chivalry went up with them. Now, with this president, practical jokesters may have to resort to renting an anti-aircraft gun. He also took time to mention his family. If we kids ever thought he worked too hard and didn't notice this, this proves us wrong, and this is my favorite. Have you ever watched your kids pack their private suitcases for a vacation? Our middle one jammed his zipper bag with drawing paper, a copy of Longfellow's poems, pencils, and paintbrushes. Our eldest, now 14, would find it impossible to move without her load of curlers, combs, and brushes. The youngest, he was just happy to go along and visit his grandparents on a Minnesota farm. In What a Week, my dad often referred to a local Codyite named Etuin Shrewdlew. Any newspaper people pick up on that? Oh, I'll spell it out for you. Etuin said things my dad wouldn't ordinarily say. Our respective parents dropped by for Christmas, said our friend Etuin Shrewdlew. The kids really enjoy having Grandpa and Grandma visit, and I've come to the conclusion that many a child is spoiled because you can't spank two grandmothers. Retribution, said our friend Etuin Shrewdlew, is stepping in your own chewing gum. And after a year or two, people started asking who Etuin Shrewdlew really was. Well, the first 12 letters on a linotype machine are ETAOINSHRDLU. Now, I don't know what my dad enjoyed better, editing the paper, writing What a Week, or shooting pictures. He carried a card which read, "Have camera will travel," and his camera was his pass to the Cody country. I'd like to introduce you to a small photo compilation of my dad's work. I culled these images from countless hours with the Park County Archives going through his old papers. I found 80 covers, but these are a few of my favorites, and this was reenacted on stage last year. I think that my dad was a genius in terms of storytelling and composition with his camera, and these photos certainly prove his deep respect for the readers, his craft as photojournalist, his appreciation for the natural beauty of the Cody country, and lastly, his love for Cody's children, including his own. So I'm just going to be quiet here, and we'll run this for a few minutes, and just like you to get to know Cody in the 50s and 60s. That's my brother, my mom, and my sister walking the lab. I don't know why that kid got 2 covers, but that was Jack Pierce, his printer. You look carefully, were the 3 mountain goats right there. The first plane I ever flew on. Summer in the park. A new golf course being built. Always hunting. This was for the opening of the Whitney Gallery of Western Art. They recreated this 4-color image of this famous Russell painting called The Prospectors, and they put it on really thick paper so you could cut it out and frame it and have a Remington at your house too. That's his good friend Dale Jones from the U.S. Forest Service. Those are the 3 of us. We were always being told to point at something to give action. That's me on the right, and I'm told that they still have those choir robes. 4th of July, Cody Stampede, looks like 58. So you remember the shot with the boy under the bull. Well, out of nearly 700 entries in 1961, the Big Fall was named by Look magazine as the 10 best sports photos of the year. And there it is. My dad was so proud of this. When Jack Richards saw it, he ribbed my dad. He said, "Ah, Kip, you've just been shooting the bull so easy, it just came easy." And here's a picture Jack took of my dad. This is what's really cool. This photograph was lost. I lost that Look magazine, which I managed to find. And I went looking for my dad, and look at what this photograph does. There's my dad, there's the photograph, and there's the magazine, circa 1961. Isn't that great? So, so I still hadn't found the actual copy of the photograph, so I contacted the library of the National Archives, and I got an archivist of the Look archives, and she said they're not in the greatest condition, but I'd be happy to take a look. It's in another building, but I'll go. And I said, well, if you wouldn't mind. Well, when I gave a version of this talk 5 years ago at the Whitney Gallery's 50th anniversary, 2 weeks before I came, I got a note from her saying that she had found the copy negative. And so I was able to get it printed. And here's the photograph, which I gave to Ernie Goppert, who was vice president of the museum at the time. So now my dad's photograph is in the museum, and you know, it's been really a wonderful journey. So I hope a few of you might make it up to Great Falls to see Waiting for a Chinook. You've already kind of seen it, but don't let that stop you. We scouted our location yesterday and today, and I just hope my dad knows that framed by $1 million masterpieces, his photographs made it into a world-class museum. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Support the Montana Historical Society, the Montana Digital Newspaper Project, and the Montana Newspaper Association, and especially your local paper. I want to thank the Cody Enterprise and Sage Publishing for allowing me to incorporate the articles, photos, and editorials into this talk and the Waiting for Chinook. I also want to thank Emmy Sprengelmeyer, who was a downsized Rocky newspaper editor who took those pictures of the Rocky, and he bought a small town newspaper in New Mexico and has never been happier. And I spent a lot of time talking about my dad, so I'd like to dedicate a reading from Waiting for a Chinook to my mom, Jean Kennan Hinton, my dad's friend and beloved wife of 35 years. She sat up many nights worrying about my dad's safety, which you can understand why. And she loved art museums, and I get that from her. And I hope I've emphasized, too, that this talk isn't just in homage to my dad, but it's to all country editors working your back-breaking hours and away from your families to bring the news to small communities all over the country who've been somewhat forgotten by the national mainstream media. And I know from personal experience that on some days they feel like Charlie Russell's waiting for a Chinook, and as the wolves close in. And so for their sacrifice and for their dedication and for their professionalism, these country editors are nothing less than heroes and can never be replaced. After 25 years as a newspaperman, my dad left newspapering and went to work as a public information officer at the U.S. Forest Service. He did it for me and my brother and sisters to give us opportunities that he and my mom never had. He retired 20 years later, Chief of Public Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, State of Colorado, and we lost him a year after he retired. In Waiting for a Chinook, I wrote a farewell from Cliff to his readers. The Cody country, a good place to live, you bet. Thus, it's with great sadness that we write to announce our resignation as editor of the Cody Enterprise. Some of you know that we've logged over 100 miles on horseback in the Shoshone National Forest backcountry. We've taken a position with the U.S. Forest Service, which in its great federal folly believes we might be of assistance in matters of public information and education. We'll be moving to Denver next month with our spirited son, our beautiful daughter, and their mother, our beloved bride. It goes without saying how much we will miss the Cody country, its people, its history, and its environs. It has been our privilege to be invited to your children's birthday parties, to listen to your troubles, to share with pride your accomplishments with our neighbors, to bring you the news locally, regionally, and nationally that is objective and correct. Our young son is certain we're embarking on a fool's mission. He likes it here, and perhaps he'll come back someday. We guess time will tell and judge, but until then, Godspeed and God bless the land of Buffalo Bill. Thank you. Thank you very much.